Just before I start, if I talk about like utilitarianism, kind of nihilism, those kind of words, do those make sense to people? Yes. Okay, cool. That's all good. I'm going to explain it with squares. And if it still doesn't make sense, it doesn't actually matter for the talk, so it's fine. When we're thinking about what we ought to do morally, perhaps we ought to do whatever would make everyone's lives go as well as possible. Or what we would agree upon if we were all thinking clearly and we knew the facts. Or maybe we should act on a rule that we could rationally wish everyone acted on. Or do what a virtuous person would do in this situation. Or maybe we should do something else. Now, I don't know which of these is true, but philosophers tell me they do. And then when I ask them which of these is true, they give me different answers. So I still don't know. And some of them even deny that any of these could be possibly true. They just say nihilism is true and all of these claims, all of these possible moral claims are false. There's no way they could even have been true. So sadly, after 5 years of studying philosophy, I still don't know what I morally ought to do. But this doesn't stop me from acting in the world. I need to do things all of the time, and those things could be better or worse. They could cohere with what I morally ought to do or not. And so I think what I should do, given this uncertainty, and given like the pervasiveness of not knowing what we morally ought to do over like thousands of years, we should probably try to kind of do our best, given that we don't know what to do. This talk will basically be about a particular kind of approach to this problem, the approach called maximizing expected moral value, and I believe we should modify that approach. So I will assume that roughly we should kind of pick the reasons that are implied by our beliefs. So if I believed any of these, they would give me reason to act in certain ways. And then I should kind of weigh them up somehow. So the term ought is sort of ambiguous. And so what we ought to do could be meant in different ways. So I'll illustrate this first with this case. So imagine that I believe it's equally likely that it'll rain or be sunny, and I have to choose whether to wear my gumboots. If it rains, I'll enjoy jumping in puddles on the way home, and if not, I'll be mildly inconvenienced by my inappropriate footwear. What should I do? Well, given that I think it's equally likely to rain or shine, I have like this really strong pro-gumboot reason. If it rains, I would really enjoy it, and I'd only have this like mild inconvenience if it doesn't rain. So I think my really strong reason to wear gumboots outweighs my weaker reason not to, and so I should wear my gumboots. Now, you might object to this. You might say, you might wait until the day that this actually happens, or like wait until later on in the day. It becomes clear that it isn't raining. And you might say, well, look, you in fact have no reason to wear your gumboots. The decision you've made is irrational because you've made the wrong decision. And I might reply, well, yeah, but I didn't know that it wasn't going to rain. Perhaps may have missed some recording. So what do you think is going on? Like when you say it might have rained today, and you say, well, I just didn't know. I didn't know which was going to be the case, and so I acted in a way that was rational given my uncertainty, given my beliefs about what reasons I had. This was the right way to act. So we can say that an action is subjectively rational when it's rational in light of my beliefs about the facts, and it's objectively rational when it's right in light of the facts themselves. And the objection that I shouldn't wear my gumboots because it didn't actually rain is a pretty weak objection. It seems like the most relevant sense of awe is the subjective sense. Although I did do what was wrong on the objective sense, the subjective sense is what's important here. So I claim that, so I'm going to talk about this subjective sense of awe as it relates to moral reasons. But my approach isn't a moral approach. It's actually a rational approach, because it will try to take into account what we have most reason to do overall, and not just what we have most moral reason to do. Okay, so here are my assumptions. I'm going to talk later about another set of assumptions which have B's in front of them. These A assumptions, like A1, they are my assumptions and they're just true for the purposes of this talk. And then the B assumptions I'm going to attack and say they're not plausible. Maybe these assumptions aren't plausible, but I'm going to take them as a given. So the first one is that the kinds of moral claims that I showed on the first slide, they're the kinds of things that could be true. But I don't claim that any of them actually are true. They just could be in some sense. And it could be the case also that none of them are true, and then kind of nihilism is true. The second thing I'm going to say is that I'm talking about this subjective rational ought. So how ought we respond to the reasons implied by our beliefs, specifically focusing on our moral beliefs. The third thing I'm going to claim is that we have moral uncertainty, or I'm going to assume that when we're talking about this, we're talking about someone who does have moral uncertainty. And there are multiple competing moral hypotheses. And then I want to kind of rule out a case where perhaps you believe in two theories, and one theory you believe in only like some tiny epsilon, and you say this amount that I believe in this theory is so small that if you pick any number, I believe in it, like any number, no matter how small, I believe in this theory less than that number you picked. And so in that case, you would kind of have moral uncertainty, but like not really. And so I want to rule it out. And finally, I assume that the right kind of approach is to look at the reasons implied by our beliefs and the strength of our our conviction in those reasons. So how much do we believe in them? Okay, so I have one small argument, which is not original, but this argument will, I hope, motivate this kind of approach to moral uncertainty. So a moral tragedy is when the available evidence warrants uncertainty in an agent's moral beliefs. So they have reason to doubt what they think is right is actually right. And if they had responded to those reasons, then they could have avoided a grave moral wrong. And so I think examples of this might be like the keeping of slaves, burning of cats for entertainment in the Middle Ages, and kind of on the whole, the treatment of Aboriginal Australians by white and European Australians. And I think we have good reason to criticize these kinds of actions. So to take kind of a historical example, I've just added this, so I haven't worked it into the slides. But if you take like an example of how Aboriginal workers were treated on like stations in the outback in kind of like the late 1800s, early 1900s, this isn't like by far the worst treatment of people that we've had, but there's just like lots of kind of not great things here. So for example, like the food that they were given was inadequate, less varied, and much like less than their white counterparts working on these farms. The shelter was much worse, and there may have been some complicating factors here. So basically, according to this book I was reading, like very early on, people were kind of more nomadic and they weren't actually worried about having kind of a European kind of housing, and so you might be kind of thinking that like, oh, this was all right because it's like very European kind of centric to think that like you need to provide that specific kind of housing to people. But then later on, it became like much more clear that this is what people wanted, and at that point they were just like flat denied having the same housing. Yeah, and so there's a quote from the book which was, "Some were creditable attempts to copy white man's style of living, whilst others were mere kennels and most insanitary." So this is like from a bunch of first-hand interviews. Yeah, and so the people who, so a few people were paid in cash. Most people were paid only in kind and in those inadequate things that I've mentioned. But those that were paid in cash, officially were only meant to get a quarter of like white people's wages. But in fact, most of the time, their wages were put into like a government account to, quote, protect them from unscrupulous salesmen, deter them from sharing along kin lines, and to encourage thrift. And then there was like no real effort to ever like make sure people actually got that money that they deserved. When they were injured, there was like kind of botched surgeries. Lots of people died from preventable diseases. And like the medical system was entirely or almost entirely geared towards white and European people. And so the quote again, most station Aboriginal people had several close relatives killed or injured by botched surgeries, amputations, and the permanent disabilities that they got received no workers' compensation. Medical services were geared toward almost exclusively towards Europeans. Yeah, sure.
Is this empirical detail in your published thesis, or just for our interest?
No, so this isn't. I haven't published anything on this yet.
No, but I mean, if
yeah.
To intend
Yeah, I think so. I think it's nice just having a like empirical example. So I'm just trying to like flesh this out and be like, is this really the case? And I'm going to argue in a second that like people really could have seen that what they were doing was horrible, sure, and they should have, and this gives us ground to criticize them. Yeah, but yeah, I probably would. It would depend. It's not very like philosophical in like the traditional way, but I think it's good. Yeah, and then so like why did they do this? I think many farmers kind of justified their treatment based on kind of racist beliefs that European workers were fundamentally different. They had different needs. Aboriginal workers didn't understand the value of money, and that they behaved irrationally. And I mentioned before, sometimes different treatment could be culturally appropriate, but it really didn't seem like this was like a fair attempt to culturally treat people differently, as was appropriate. So, and then I also claim that these fundamental differences that they saw, they had really good, strong reasons to believe that they weren't there. And so I have an example of, like, there was an interview with someone who said, I've seen good black stockmen worked into the ground and gins used up, tossed aside like old greenhide ropes. I was as bad as the rest, and the thoughts of what I did sometimes makes me cry. And so I think this kind of thing indicates that at the time they really could see what they were doing. And they perhaps didn't believe even mostly that what they were doing was wrong, but they at least probably had some idea. And then they took this, like, risk where if what they were doing was wrong, it's quite gravely wrong. And if what they're doing is okay, then they just kind of save a bit of money, or, like, it's like mildly more convenient for them. And so in that kind of case, I think this is like if we would condemn the actions of, like, a drink driver, because even though they may think there's, like, a low chance that they'll injure someone, if they do injure someone, it's, like, really horrible. And if they don't injure someone, it's just they, like, save the cost of an Uber, and it's relatively trivial to losing a life. And so I think people in the past are open to this criticism, but I think we too could be criticized by future generations. And so what we should do is we should try to avoid these criticisms by examining our beliefs carefully and trying to figure out how to act correctly in light of our uncertainty about the facts, including the moral facts. So yeah, it's basically the last point. And I wonder which of our current actions will make our children and grandchildren shudder, so we should try to avoid similar moral tragedies. And I think this is the kind of thing that might motivate you to really take moral uncertainty seriously, even if you were thinking, well, like, I'm pretty sure this is the right theory, maybe I should just follow it. Well, people at lots of different times were pretty sure they were doing the right thing and they weren't. And so we should be open to kind of looking at where we could be going wrong. Okay, so that example was a lot. I will use very superficial philosophical examples from now on in the talk. Well, how could we do this? Well, imagine we have two options, and these squares are reasons, and theory one gives us two reasons for option A and one reason for option B. And theory two gives us one reason for each option A and B. And so I've just done the white squares as theory one and the black squares as theory two. Yeah. So it may initially seem like we should pick option A. There's 3 reasons for A and only 2 reasons for B. But I think, well, what if the reasons for B are much stronger? So what if the reason for B on theory 2 is much stronger? Well, in this case, it would seem like we should pick option B. So we should look at the strength of our reasons as well. But maybe theory 2 is, like, just not very likely. And if it's not very likely, we should kind of scale down the reasons on theory 2 and scale up the reasons on theory 1. And then option A is now kind of looking a lot better. And we'll choose whichever one we have most kind of weighted reason to do, which will be, we'll choose the biggest area if we're illustrating it with squares. And this is basically what that, like, annoying looking formula meant. And so basically, just to very quickly spell it out, although it's, like, not very important, We're like assigning values which represent the strength of reasons to different options, to different actions. And then we're weighting them by our degree of belief, or like how strongly we believe in that theory. And then we're looking at kind of acts that are feasible, so things that we could do, and we're picking whichever kind of like maximizes that, or has the biggest area related to that. Okay, so what do we need to do to make this approach work? Well, we need to assume two things to make it like possibly true, and we need to assume a third thing to make it kind of plausibly true. So we can kind of assume B1 that these that theories that we believe in satisfy some axioms, and those axioms are just meant to make what these theories say consistent. So then we need to assume comparability, that when we have these evaluations, when we have these strengths of reasons, that they're actually comparable with each other. And I'll spell out what all of these mean in more detail. And thirdly, that it's actually possible for the relevant agents, which are us, to knowingly act in accordance with this theory. And if we can't act in accordance with it, then I think it loses a lot of the kind of intuitive appeal. So the appeal was sort of, this is more important than the objective sense of ought, maybe sometimes, just because we don't know what we actually ought to do, and we can know what we subjectively ought to do. So we can know kind of what maybe this theory says. But if we can't actually know what it says, then why would we say we should do the subjectively right thing rather than we just do the right thing? Seems like there's no motivation for it if B3 is not true. Although, like, technically, like, to make the maths work, you don't need to assume B3. It's just not a useful theory. We don't have that. All right. So now I will tell you my overall argument. So first, I will illustrate that each of these assumptions is implausible, and each of them leave maximize expected moral value on them vulnerable. So, for example, B3 is not true for us. It forces us to modify our theory, and this modification potentially weakens it. But this modification will be what I call the trade-off approach. And this modification will help us solve or partially solve the problems when those assumptions are not true. Okay, so that's the overview. The sections from now on will just be each of those like assumptions, what happens when it's not true, and what I think we should do about it. So the first assumption was, actually, sorry, I'll just get rid of that quote. So the first assumption was that we can actually know what this theory says. What would we have to do to know what it says? Well, if we just believed hedonic utility theory, then we would have to represent ourselves in every possible world where we could choose that option, down to the last relevant detail, assign each world a probability, go through each world, add up the total quantity of happiness minus suffering, multiply each of those sums by the associated probability, and add up all of those products. That was if we just if we just believed one theory. But then if we believe more, to compute the expected choice-worthiness or moral value of an option, I must do all of this plus an analogous task for every other objective norm or every other theory besides hedonistic total utilitarianism. in which I have positive credence, then take a probability weighted sum of the results. Needless to say, no human ever has computed the expected choice worthiness of an option or is ever likely to. So if we can't calculate what this theory says, clearly we don't know what it says. Especially, we would have to do this for every option in every situation. I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's going to work out. So this assumption that it's possible for relevant agents to know and act in accordance with them, we can kind of make this more precise, or like show one implication of it is that we can actually calculate and compare the expected value of actions under moral uncertainty, but this is just false. And we can reply to this. So there is a reply to this argument, which is, sure, this assumption is false, but we can approximate it. So when we act in the world, we act as if we are maximizing expected moral value, even though we're not in our heads calculating expected moral value. And this is the kind of move that you might make in economics when you say kind of people are utility maximizers, and someone objects, well, no, they're not. I've never like gone to the supermarket and looked at every possible product I could buy and thought about the value that each of them would bring me, and thought about all of the other things that I could possibly spend my money on, including like holidays and eating out and donating to charity and everything else that I could have bought instead of spending like $2 on milk before making my decision. No one does that. The claim would be people act as if they do, and this is a good way to model them. But the whole point here was that this was meant to guide our action. So I think this reply will only be satisfying if we can sort of say how it is that we can approximate this sort of thing. It's meant to tell us something, like it's meant to be a positive theory. And so, yeah, so I don't think this reply will be convincing unless we can indicate how it is that we approximate this theory. So I claim that this is how, maybe, this is part of how at least. So we can identify the reasons implied by our beliefs, we can identify which reasons we must trade off when we act, and we can choose an appropriate trade-off. And so when I'm talking about trade-offs, you can imagine that I trade off when I use my time to, say, give a talk rather than sitting at home watching Netflix. This is like, I clearly can't do both, and I must kind of choose a trade-off for my time, which is appropriate, and the trade-offs are kind of given by the world in that case. And so this is like one kind of insight of expected value theory. It's usually fleshed out in economics in terms of like the partial derivatives. But I think it's more general than that. It's more important. It doesn't really rely on kind of value functions being continuous. So this is part of expected moral value, but I think this part's like important. And if we were going to give a complete kind of theory of, yeah, so if we were going to give a complete theory of what to do under moral uncertainty that is like relevant for like bounded agents, so for us like this, we would also need to include kind of a stopping rule for how long we like deliberate or so on, and also kind of perhaps like an inclusion rule for like which options we include when we're deliberating or which theories we include. But I'm not going to talk about those things. Oh, and also something about how we actually form our beliefs in the relevant sense. But I'm not going to talk about any of those things. I'm just going to talk about trade-offs. And I think this will give us a reply to a couple of different things. So this is me eating a piece of cake. Sadly, I've not gotten any better at eating cake since then. So philosophical case. I'm out to dinner with friends and I must choose between a beef burger, which I slightly prefer, or a vegetarian gnocchi. I believe hedonistic utilitarianism completely, but I believe two forms of it are equally likely. Either animals have no moral weight because suffering requires complex mental states that are only found in humans, or they have the same moral weight as humans, and in both hypotheses, eating a human burger would be a grave moral wrong. So eating an animal burger on one hypothesis would be just as bad as eating a human burger. And on the other hypotheses, it's not morally wrong. It's morally permissible, and it's also kind of what I have slight non-moral reason to do because that's what I prefer. All right, what should I do? Well, I think, so if I was following maximize expected moral value, then again, I'd have to represent all of these hedonic states of all the animals in all of the possible worlds where I could choose this option. And I couldn't do that. But I think we can make moral decisions under uncertainty in this kind of case. We can just recognize that we have a strong reason not to eat the burger on one hypothesis, and a very weak reason, or so no moral reason, to not eat it. And then because we think these things are equally likely, this strong moral reason is also much stronger than our weak kind of rational or non-moral reason to eat the burger. And so we shouldn't eat the burger. That's the trade-off we should make. We can make decisions here. Yeah.
Like, if you believe that animals have no moral weight, more strongly than you believe they do have the same complex mental state as humans, then you would choose to eat the burger because that's what you would prefer, and you don't believe.
I think you would have to believe it was very unlikely, that animals had the same mental states as humans. Okay. So I think this is so one way to illustrate this is to look at an analogy between normal risk and moral risk, where you say, well, what if an action is it's you're I don't know, I'm not sure if I've put a bullet in this gun. It's 50, I'm a little bit more sure than not that I didn't put one in, but I'm still at least 40% sure that I have put one in. And then you kind of shoot at your friend, and I think you'd be very culpable for your actions if you killed them. And similarly, even if you were slightly more sure that it wasn't like eating a human burger, you should maybe still not do it. But there would be some point where if you were just overwhelmingly sure that eating the burger was fine, then maybe your weak preference reason would outweigh it. You'll run into problems if you try and specify exactly what that point is. I don't know what that point is, and that's kind of part of the issue with comparisons that we'll address later. Yeah, cool. Okay, so I've already said that this is a partial account. I jumped the gun on that one. So that was just that we'd need other things if we were to make a kind of full account. But then also, what about if we have a theory that claims something we have no reason to do this kind of act, or no reason to phi, as philosophers like to put it. Well, we can include this in our kind of weighing up of our trading off of reasons. So we could trade off, we have some belief that we have reason to phi, and we have some belief that we don't have such a reason. Or we could build that into our beliefs. So we could be my belief about phi is just weaker than if I fully believed it. and that weights our reason somehow. But we shouldn't do both, right? To do both would be to double count. And I think it's just like just upon reflection, much more plausible that we do it when we're forming our beliefs. We think about the things we have no reason, like claims like we have no reason, that should kind of weaken our belief that we have reason A. And then when we're thinking about what reasons we have, well, like we have this like weakened reason A. So this is just a claim I make, and then this will basically rescue us in a minute. So nihilism. Here I am again. I didn't realize I was in here twice. I thought I had a picture of Michael eating noodles, but I think I changed it because I was like, I'm recording this, and I don't know if he wants a picture of him eating noodles on the internet. So here I am eating cake. No, yeah, I'm not better at it. I'm terrible at eating cake. I love it though. So this case is just like the first case, except now I kind of believe that nihilism is possible. I have 10% belief that nihilism is possible, like 1 in 10 nihilism, and 9 in 10 not nihilism. And if nihilism is false, then I basically have the same beliefs. Like either animals have no moral weight or they're equal to humans. Now in this situation, I mean, like, because of the question, I've already kind of mentioned this, I think you'd still basically be able to make a decision. But under maximize expected moral value, you can't. And this is kind of a problem where like you should be able to ignore nihilism, but like it's just a kind of problem where it's easier to see that we should be able to ignore nihilism than it is to like actually show that we can. And so I'm giving an attempt to show why we can. So according to Ross, nihilism is the view that notions of good and bad and right and wrong are illusions, and that objectively speaking, no option or state of affairs is better than any other, nor are any two options or states of the affairs equally good, and thus, while uniform theories assign the same value to all of our options, nihilistic theories don't assign values to any of our options. And so one way you might try and include nihilism is we could try to include it as a uniform function. And this is the kind of thing that Ross is sort of thinking. But this is not actually a way that we can represent nihilism, because assigning, so uniform function firstly just assigns the same value to every option. But note just in the description of nihilism, we say nihilistic theories don't assign values to any of our, nihilistic theories don't assign values to any of our options. And so they're not just a straightforward uniform theory like this. If they were, you just get rid of them and it would be easy. Uniform theories just don't make a difference according to maximize expected moral value. But this would misrepresent nihilism, and the only way to represent it would be as assigning undefined value to each action. But this makes all of our options have undefined expected value. So we multiply by this undefined value, and then all of our options have undefined values. So none of our options are better, worse, or equal to each other. That's just what undefined means. And so basically, this theory will become useless. But as I've already said, we should be able to make decisions. Yeah, so we should be able to make decisions, and we can do it with trade-offs. So this broke one of our assumptions. It's not really that important, but it broke the B1 assumption. But I've claimed if a theory makes a claim of the form, we have no reason to phi, we should ignore this while making our decisions, and we should only incorporate this into our beliefs. So nihilism does not provide any positive moral reasons. And so all it says is we don't have reason X, we don't have reason Y, we don't have any reasons. And so it weakens all of our reasons. So the more we believe in nihilism, the weaker our moral reasons are. But it doesn't kind of get rid of them. And that's kind of all it can do. And so if we're just thinking about our moral reasons, then we'll just make the same decision we did before. And if we're using our non-moral reasons will grow relatively stronger. This seems like kind of the intuitive result that we wanted to me. So if I believe that I have no moral reasons, and I believe that like more and more, then my non-moral reasons should get much stronger than my moral reasons.
Like non-moral reasons, like prudential norms and so on.
Yeah.
Do they exist if there are no moral reasons?
Well, I don't know. Do they?
Probably a bit of a tangent.
Let's assume for now that they do. Should have added that into my assumptions. Yeah, no, so I'm not really giving a proper account of non-moral reasons, but if there are some, this is what they do.
It's not essential.
Yeah. So if there aren't any, then we're just looking at moral reasons, and that's like most of what I'm talking about anyway. So it's fine to me if there aren't any, and if there are some, it's like I just can include them, it's fine. All right, this is the final and longest part of the talk. Actually, no, it might not be the longest part of the talk. I think the intro is now, because I included that like long example. But this is like, we're almost done. Okay, so do we even need comparability? Yes, we do. And it's easy to see why. So imagine that we have like some options A and B that we could choose, and these squares represent an initial way of representing our reasons. So clearly, option A has much more reason than option B. But basically, without this like specified comparisons, without specifying a like basically a size of each theory, we can make the reasons for B big enough that we just choose B. And basically, like we can choose any option that that there's at least one theory we believe in that likes that option or believes that option is most valuable. Then we can just like make that option the option that we should choose overall. And that seems bad. That seems like way too permissive. So we can do that. So initially we would pick A. We can do what's called a positive affine transformation, which is basically making those squares bigger. So all of the squares for one theory have to scale the same, basically. So I can't just make the squares for B bigger. That would be even more ridiculous, but this is still quite ridiculous. And then I can zoom out a bit, and I can make them bigger again. So these are all the squares for theory 2, get bigger. And now because theory 2 prefers option B, we now pick option B. That's the one we choose. And this seems bad, right? Do we agree? Yep, cool. Yeah, so we can kind of think about comparisons in a strong or weak sense. So a set of theories are strongly comparable when we know which of two reasons is stronger and exactly how much stronger in any situation. And they're weakly comparable when we sometimes know which of the two reasons is stronger. And now you need the strong comparability claim in order to make maximize expected moral value work. And so they admit this. There's like extra work about how you might construct this. If you don't have it, I'm not going to discuss that work, but if someone's like particularly interested in them, I can send them what I think about it. So what happens here? If we don't have strong comparability, and I don't think we do, so I will put it on the slide why I don't think that. Yeah, I don't know. So like people just have specific cases that they look to. They go like, hey, look, imagine that you have one theory that says never murder, and you have one theory that says in this situation it's slightly better to murder someone than not. Or like in this situation you should murder someone, and you're like kind of weighing up these reasons. Look, you don't know exactly what creed. So actually, yeah. So the case we talked about before, I think is good. When if my like belief that eating the beef burger was like a human burger, if my belief in that kind of goes down, there'll be some point at which I should perhaps, well, some point at which it might be permissible for me to eat the burger, even though I have this strong moral reason against. I believe it's like very, very unlikely that I actually, in fact, have that reason. But exactly at which point, well, I don't know. And if I don't know that, then strong comparability is false. So you'd have to be able to be like, oh, it's like when you have like 2% exactly credence, you have 1.99% credence, then you can eat the beef burger. If you have 2.01% credence, then you can't. And you need lots of those kinds of claims. And so I just don't think that we have that. Do we have weak comparability? Can we ever make comparisons? So some of the arguments indicate no. So Gracely in 1996 writes that intertheoretic value comparisons are intrinsically invalid, essentially meaningless, and ultimately meaningless and fruitless. And yeah, so he seems to think that we can never make these comparisons, and he makes a couple of arguments and he gives a couple of cases. But I think we can. So I think the examples I've already seen are basically I just was making comparisons and it seemed fine. And if we kind of look at what would it mean if we rejected weak comparability, well, comparability is like actually quite a general thing. So we can think of different theories giving evaluations and kind of asking, are these theories like how do we compare their claims? We can think of people, say in a democracy or in a society, kind of having different preferences, and those preferences could be stronger or weaker than each other. And if you reject weak comparability, you just can't say anything like that. So like my preference to like not lose my leg couldn't be stronger than anyone's preference to like eat a sandwich. The sandwich one wouldn't be stronger, but my leg wouldn't be strong. One wouldn't be stronger. There'd just be nothing you could say about which is stronger. It also applies, sorry.
No, it's just an example. Is there a distinction between moral beliefs across agents to moral beliefs within agents? So one person's preference, not to lose their, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, sorry, just tell me what you're getting at. So I can.
Well, in the case you give, there's two different beliefs across agents. So
yeah.
A says, I want sandwich more than I want this guy to lose his
yeah,
leg,
yeah.
in the reverse.
Yeah.
But in this case, is it more like I believe that I shouldn't use myself as a means, but
yeah.
I have another credence that I should maximize the good and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think so basically you're looking at what people kind of like people's preferences. And on the one hand, and you're looking at what theories say, or theories like evaluations on the other hand. And I think like the problem is kind of analogous.
So subjectively, I might say, well, maybe I lean towards Kantianism 60%.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
But if you say like I lean towards this theory, but I have some belief in this one,
Yeah.
I think if you can't make comparisons across them, then there's like nothing you can do in the uncertainty kind of, or the uncertainist kind of this style of like reasoning.
Yeah.
And it's even more general than that. So if we think about our own lives, I at different times might feel different things, and I could be like thinking about like how good or bad some experience is. And if I have if weak comparability is also false, then I wouldn't be able to say something like, when I'm severely depressed, that's worse than when I'm like very elated, right? There'd be no fact of the matter. There would be nothing that I'd be pointing to. And so clearly I can say that. And clearly weak comparability is very plausible. I think strong comparability becomes implausible because it's it's at least rejecting it doesn't seem that bad, even in the kind of my own experiences case. So if I think about maybe there was two like very bad events that were both like 15 years ago, maybe I can't like figure out which is worse, but I can sometimes make comparisons, and that's the weak comparability claim. So if we can sometimes make weak comparability claims, what does this mean? Well, if theories are completely comparable, then we'll always know the appropriate trade-offs that we can make. And in that case, we'll be able to make decisions. And this is kind of the only case that maximize expected moral value works. But I think we should be able to kind of work this out when theories are partially comparable. So for at least some options, we know which trade-offs are appropriate. Well, then if we face those options, we can make the right trade-off. So if they're partially comparable and we happen to be in the situation when they are. And then thirdly, kind of when theories all agree about which option we should do, we should also be able to decide. So if I believe a theory which says like, don't murder this person, that would be a horrible thing to do. And another theory which says, don't murder this person because murder is wrong, I should be able to decide not to murder this person despite my moral uncertainty. And finally, so sorry, I've read these out of order, but the second one down is if they're non-comparable. And in that case, you would need to say more. And that is outside of the scope of this talk. I'll just briefly mention that the thing that's really new about this idea is how I've analyzed it in terms of what trade-offs are available. And I've illustrated that you can make the appropriate trade-offs in these ways. There could be other modifications of maximize expected moral value that kind of allow you to make these claims, and not just the trade-off approach. So you could maybe look at like values like as intervals, and then kind of if the intervals are completely apart, then you'll be able to figure out what to do. In the case of agreement, all of your like basically all of your theories are pushing the same way. So you'd look at like, well, what are the ways that I could specify comparisons? And on each of them, it would be the case that you should like so in the murder case, in each of the ways you could specify comparisons, your theory will tell you not to murder people. And so you can just like kind of not murder people. And so this isn't like entirely unique to my view, but I've analyzed it in terms of trade-offs, so it's interesting, I guess. I've been speaking for a while, and now I'm going to conclude. Okay. So my conclusion is this. Oh no. I've no conclusion at all. Yeah. So I've argued that we must modify maximize expected moral value because of this objection from boundedness, from our inability to calculate maximize expected moral value, and that this was part of the motivation for the theory. I called this modification the trade-off approach to moral uncertainty, and developed the approach with like a brief sketch of some of the features. And I claim that this approach helps us with, in the case of nihilism, and kind of using it to analyze comparisons, it also helps us there. And so given that this approach seems quite fruitful against some of the problems with maximizing expected moral value, I think maybe it's the thing that people should endorse if they're like interested in this kind of approach. This might be one way you could go.